Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman.
This week on Heroic Media, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds religious liberty in a challenge to the federal contraception mandate.
New statistics on sexually transmitted infections dispel the myth of safe sex for teens.
A federal appeals court strikes down Utah's ban on same-sex marriage.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media. So here at Heroic Media, we discuss headlines that deal with issues of family and marriage and life. And these are really foundational moral issues. And so that's why we really look at some of these fundamental concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the stories that we'll discuss are about like abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Exactly. So Patrick, what's our first story for the day?
All right, in our first story, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld religious freedom for Hobby Lobby in a 5-4 ruling that said that Hobby Lobby and other businesses like it cannot be forced to violate their religious beliefs via the Hhs mandate. So this was a huge victory for pro-lifers and Christians across the nation.
Absolutely.
And so what were your reactions to this?
Well, I think, a lot of people were surprised by this ruling. I think that the administration was surprised by this ruling because they had been very confident in asserting that they were going to move forward with this mandate and that it was absolutely fine. And just to give our viewers a little bit of background, the Hhs mandate, what that's doing is it's telling employers that they have to provide insurance coverage that includes contraception, sterilization, and some drugs that can even cause early abortions. And that they have to provide those for their employees for free. And so there have been over 300 plaintiffs that have filed lawsuits saying, hey, this absolutely violates my religious beliefs. My religion forbids me from doing this. I believe that all life is sacred. I believe that sex is sacred. And I cannot be forced into doing this because the First Amendment protects me. The idea of religious freedom protects me from being forced to do that.
Exactly. And so the Affordable Care Act was put in place in 2010. And pretty much ever since then, there's just been this kind of a lot of contention, especially amongst business owners that have religious beliefs, specifically Christian beliefs in a lot of cases. And it's kind of culminated almost, at least for me, and you're watching this happen over the past few years in this Hobby Lobby case. So it was kind of a big deal because we were at a junction where we were saying, okay, if you own a business, do you forfeit the right to practice your religion?
Exactly.
And so, because here in the U.S., we have those freedoms. We have the freedom to follow our morals and our religious beliefs. And so the real question with this whole case was, that's really what it came down to, was this battle of individual rights versus when you own a business.
Right.
And so as a business owner, sure, the common case is, well, if you don't want contraception, then don't use it. But it's not just a case of that. It's also a case of you are paying for it for other people.
Right, exactly.
And in the case of Hobby Lobby, they actually do offer, even after this ruling, a wide variety of contraception.
16 different kinds.
There you go, 16 different kinds of contraception for their employees after this ruling. So it wasn't with all contraception that they had an issue with. It was with the immoral, what they deemed via their religious beliefs as being immoral. And those contraceptives that they deemed immoral were ones that could end a human life.
Right, exactly. And so these are evangelical Protestants, our Christian brothers and sisters. They don't have a problem with all contraception, just with these few ones. And that's something that's being widely misunderstood. But basically, I think what we really have to get down to in this case is just the idea that we shouldn't have to forfeit our religious rights and our ability to live out our faith when we go into business. Because the whole core of Christianity is that we are Christian all the time. We're not just Christian at our house, at our church. We have to live out those beliefs everywhere. We have to live out those beliefs when we're in the supermarket. We have to live out those beliefs when we're at work. And so the whole fundamental premise of being a Christian says that you can't abandon your beliefs
Right.
when you enter business. When you're making business decisions, you have to have those beliefs at the core of that. And actually, Hobby Lobby, the owners, it's a family, the Green family,
Right.
and they pay their employees much higher than minimum wage.
Yep.
They have all of their stores are closed on Sundays. They're sort of known for that, so that their employees can spend time with their family.
Yep.
They do a lot of charitable work. And so in operating their business, they say we can't separate our Christian beliefs from our business side of things. These have to be integrated.
Right, and people shouldn't separate their beliefs regardless of what it is, right? Like even with your, I mean, if you love your wife, you're gonna love her all the time, not just while you're at your house or just while you're in front of other people or whatever, right? Like if you truly believe something and feel something, then you should hold those beliefs all the time. And that's what the, what our rights tell us, is that we can do that. And so this case was really about those rights. And Barbara Green, co-founder of Hobby Lobby, said this. She said, "Today the nation's highest court has reaffirmed the vital importance of religious liberty as one of our country's founding principles. The court's decision is a victory, not just for our family business, but for all who seek to live out their faith." And I think it really is a victory. And people that were not, people that were not on board with this ruling were just kind of up in arms. But I think that it was a great balance, right? Because it still allows women, it doesn't deny women, access to contraception. It just denies them the, the ability to force their employers to buy it for them for free, right? So they can still get it. They can get it however they want. They can get it for very inexpensive, $9 at Target or whatever, right? You can get it for free at a lot of places, Planned Parenthood. I mean, it's pretty easy to get a hold of this stuff. And so in a lot of these cases, I feel like it's just people are kind of, they're flipping out about, some people are flipping out about this.
The responses to this have been ridiculous. And just to make it clear, this is not denying women the access to this. This is turning back the clock all the way to 2010, when there was such a huge crisis in access to birth control. I don't think so. This is saying, okay, women, if this is important to you, to your lifestyle, you take the money that you earn and you go pay for it yourself. Right now, employers are not required to cover vision, to cover eye care. So if your employer doesn't cover your contact lenses, are they denying you access to see? No, you have to say, okay, this is important to me, I need this, I'm gonna take my money and I'm gonna budget and I'm gonna pay for this. So, and that's less of a lifestyle choice, that really is necessary if you need corrective lenses, than birth control. And
absolutely.
So really, if you look at this ruling was not as radical and absurd as people are saying. It's very rational.
Not at all. And I like that example too, because when you go to work for a company, first of all, you can choose that company and they have benefits and they can choose what they cover and what they don't. And like you said, like contraceptive would be more of an elective type of thing than like an actual, you have to have it or you're going to suffer. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So, in our next story, a study out of New Zealand adds to the growing body of evidence suggesting that the idea of safe sex is harming our young people. The study showed an increase in sexually transmitted infections, but no decrease in pregnancy or abortion rates.
Interesting. So a lot of times what we hear when talking like from organizations like Planned Parenthood and other organizations that promote the use of contraceptives and sexual promiscuity is we hear that you can do whatever you want, everything's gonna be fine, just be sure to use safe sex or protect yourself or whatever, right? So of course that primarily deals with condom use. And so studies like this isn't the only study. There's other studies. In 2012, there's a study in the US. In 2011, there's a study that was done in the UK. And all these studies find that indeed that it does not show a reduction in this, right? In fact, there is an increase in these studies in sexually transmitted infections, STIs, right? So, so what do you think the disconnect is here?
Well, I think the disconnect is just the idea that's being sold here, the sort of like, oh, this in theory is going to, everybody's going to be so responsible about it, whereas in reality we know that, first of all, people do not always use these things correctly. Second of all, they don't always work correctly even when you use them properly. And third of all, this is encouraging people to engage in sexual activity at a younger age because they think they're protected. If we were going out telling kids, look, here's the reality. This is what you risk. You risk all these sexually transmitted infections. You risk an unplanned pregnancy. You risk all these things. They might say, oh gosh, this is not something I want to do. Whereas when you're saying, here, we're going to empower you by giving you these devices and these drugs, then you're just encouraging them to do this. And I think the results are clear. This new study in New Zealand, the rate of chlamydia, this is a sexually transmitted infection, is 633 per 100,000 of the population. In Australia, that rate is just 355 per 100,000. And so what this study is doing is it's saying, oh, New Zealand has all this great access to emergency contraception.
Right.
Which, just to clarify, is not contraception necessarily. If you've already conceived, you take it after you have sex. So if you have already conceived, that can cause an early abortion.
Yes.
But they said, oh, we're going to introduce this and it's going to be wonderful. And it really has not lowered any rates of abortions or rates of pregnancies. It's just resulted in a correlation with an increase of sexually transmitted infections.
Right, and it gives people a false sense of expectation,
Absolutely.
too. They feel like they're protected, and so they go, oh, well, I have access to emergency contraception. Of course, a lot of times emergency contraception happens as an emergency, you know, like after you've had sex. And so typically unprotectedness has already occurred. Right, unprotectedness. So, I mean, it makes sense, right, that
Absolutely.
the STIs have increased in these areas. And I think I think what they forget a lot of times too in these studies, even with the case of promoting like condom use, is that when you tell people you can have sex all you want with as many people as you want, you don't have to worry about anything as long as you're using protection, that, like you already mentioned, a lot of times it doesn't work, you know. And I think one of the things that gets overlooked a lot of times is that people are usually in the heat of the moment when things are going on like this. And so they forget, or they're not thinking about it, or they don't want to bother, they don't want to interrupt, they don't like, so they start out with the mindset of, oh, I'm going to be fine. Then they get into a situation where they may inadvertently slip up and they don't end up doing what they thought they were going to do.
And I just have to add that as a woman, I think that this is horribly offensive. I think this is very anti-woman, because this contraception is just allowing women to be used and to be treated as an object. Women tend to have worse responses to sexually transmitted infections.
No, that's liberation.
Right, exactly. And it's awful, because women deserve to know better. They deserve information. That's what's going to actually empower them. And women deserve better than this false sense of security that is going to leave them with an unexpected pregnancy or some kind of disease.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Well, stay tuned with us. We will have a special guest coming up after the break to discuss a new ruling on marriage out of Utah.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. We have a special guest joining us for this segment, Jenny Kraska, the Executive Director of the Colorado Catholic Conference. Jenny, thanks for being with us here today.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to discuss a story with you involving the first time that a federal appeals court has struck down a state's definition of marriage. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, by a 2-to-1 vote, rejected Utah's laws which define marriage as being between one man and one woman. So Jenny, here we have a 3-person panel, and in fact it was 2 people on that panel. We have 2 people who get to redefine marriage for an entire state that has held the definition of marriage that has, you know, a timeless definition that has been around since the very beginning of the state. What do you think about that?
That's correct. That is exactly what happened with the 10th Circuit. I found it to be an extraordinarily overreaching opinion by the majority. They actually went above and beyond just simply redefining marriage for the state of Utah. They actually said that it is a fundamental right, that people in Utah have a fundamental right to marry under the 14th Amendment of our Constitution, which is extraordinarily broad and very sweeping, and I think will have tremendous consequences not only for the other states in the 10th Circuit, but for other appellate courts that will consider this issue, I'm sure, in the very near future.
So what is it about the 14th Amendment that they use to basically support their case?
Sure, it was a couple of things. They basically say that there is an equal protection argument, a due process argument under our Constitution that allows for same-sex couples in Utah to have this fundamental right to marriage, which has never been decided before. I mean, even Windsor, I think the dissent in this case alluded to that fact that Windsor did not establish a fundamental right to marriage. What the Windsor case did is just say that, you know, in states that already have same-sex marriage, certain benefits need to be applicable to same-sex couples as they are to heterosexual couples. And the 10th Circuit went, I believe, far above and beyond that, and provided this additional language of fundamental rights. And that's a very tricky area to get into when you're talking about the Constitution and things like marriage. I mean, fundamental rights a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Right, absolutely. And so this, as you say, the Windsor case, that was the Supreme Court case. And this is going beyond that and much beyond that, because that specifically did not include that fundamental right. And with the DOMA case with the Supreme Court, it just said, we're going to respect whatever laws the states have. That's what the federal government will respect. And in this case, it's saying, no, state, you do not have the right to have your own laws. We're going to tell you, these two judges are going to tell you what you have to have. And the fallout from it has been significant. In Colorado, actually up in Boulder County, they decided to start giving out same-sex marriage licenses, even though Colorado does not recognize same-sex marriage at all.
That's
and
correct.
They cited the Utah ruling in doing that.
Right. Yeah, Boulder County is, there's always kind of a joke about Boulder County as sort of its own little entity out in Colorado, but it's very disturbing to see that they are in defiance of really what the law is. And I mean, there was a good reason why the 10th Circuit panel said that they were going to stay their decision. I mean, that means they're going to put on hold actually implementing their ruling until other courts decide this issue or until there's more of an appeals process that happens. And I think that's significant as well. That basically told the other states in the 10th Circuit, you guys don't get to follow what we've decided for Utah. This is a decision for Utah. We understand there's going to be probably more appeals with this happening, but Boulder has just decided to do their own thing, and the Attorney General has threatened legal action if they don't cease and desist with that within the next week.
Wow. And it seems like a lot of times nowadays with these laws and things, situations like this come up a lot where it feels to me at least like laws are being like forced ahead of their time. You know what I mean? Like people get these like the DOMA ruling and everything, and people just take these wild assumptions out of those. So what hope is there for, I guess, pro-traditional marriage supporters in appealing these cases and getting to a higher court? What is your personal opinion on that?
I think that's a good question. I think what will happen is I definitely think Utah will appeal this. Whether there's a couple different options that they have in terms of appealing this, but I think it will be appealed, and I think it will be something that will have to be decided ultimately by the Supreme Court. Right. And given the decision in Windsor and given the language that said, certain aspects of DOMA are not being repealed with the Windsor decision, namely, we're going to leave this issue to the states, I'm hopeful that they will stick to their word on that, and that will in fact hold true, and they will say that DOMA, that section of DOMA is not repealed, and that states do have the right to decide what the definition of marriage is going to be for their state.
Absolutely. And I think, that aspect of it, the legal aspect, is critical, because now we're going to have a whole generation of children who grow up where same-sex marriage is recognized and it becomes the norm, and that really does shape culture. But at the same time, we have to say, what else can we do to influence the culture if these laws are going this way, if these court cases keep coming in? I think it's important also to say, what can we do in our own homes as Catholic men and women? What can we do to try to influence the culture and shape it and fix it and build back up a strong culture of marriage? I think we're seeing the bishops talking about that increasingly.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think what we need to recognize is that we still have to be a strong voice for marriage. As Catholics, we have a right and a duty to participate in the public square, to make our voices heard, and we have to take that seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you think that, just one last question, how do you think that, what do you think the best way is to approach people that don't really have the same religious views that Christians have regarding marriage? How do we explain this to them? And I know that might be a complicated question, but have you found any success in a particular way of, explaining why we are against same-sex marriage and how this negatively impacts society, et cetera?
Sure. I mean, that's a difficult question.
It's a tough question.
It's a complex question, but I mean,
yeah.
Simply, I mean, my response to folks that don't come from any particular religious tradition is to say marriage is an institution that far predated religion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or Christianity or any kind of faith tradition. And I think we only have to look back if they want that sort of empirical evidence. It's out there.
Right.
And so I try to point people in that direction.
And that's how we're here today, right? It's based on that foundational principle of marriage, one man and one woman.
That's right.
Okay, thank you so much, Jenny. We really appreciate your joining us for this discussion.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, stay tuned. We have one more segment coming up after the break. Welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story, recent strides in stem cell research have shown that adult stem cells are ever more promising. The new discoveries have quelled controversy surrounding the use of embryonic stem cell research as well. So this is kind of cool, right? We've talked about this before, stem cell research. Of course, just to kind of give a little bit of background, the Catholic Church isn't anti-science or anything like that. History proves it, right? Scientific method, the Big Bang Theory. And, you know, there's so many things that have come from Catholics in the Catholic Church. With stem cells, the Catholic Church is not against stem cell research in and of itself. The Catholic Church is just against the use of embryonic stem cells. And so why don't you explain a little bit about why they're against embryonic stem cells?
So there's two main different types of stem cells. With an embryonic stem cells, you take a sperm and an egg and you create an embryo, which is a new human being in its earliest stage, and then you extract the stem cells from that, discard the human being, and use the stem cells. Right. So the church is absolutely opposed to that because you're taking a human being and just creating and destroying this human being for its body part, essentially.
Right.
And that's absolutely immoral. But the reason that scientists have tried to look into this is that these embryonic stem cells can be turned into any body part, and so they can grow into any kind of tissue. And so the scientists say, oh, there must be a lot of promise in them.
Exactly.
And then in adult stem cell research, that comes from the placenta, the umbilical cord, bone marrow, any kind of stem cell that comes from adult tissue that's not from an embryo.
Exactly.
And that actually has been very successful. It's limited because it can only become certain types of tissue, but it has been very successful, and it is completely ethical. There's no problem. There's no human being that's being destroyed.
Exactly.
So the church is in favor of that.
Exactly. And so as these discoveries continue, they've done now with the adult stem cells, also called somatic stem cells, what they've done is they run it through a process, and it creates what's called an induced pluripotent stem cell, or IPS.
And what is that?
And so what that allows it to do, it basically puts the adult stem cell into this embryonic-like state. And so that's really cool and very promising, because what that will allow us to do is get basically all the benefits of, well, perceived benefits, because we haven't actually realized benefits, of the embryonic stem cells, but while using an accepted means, basically a moral means, with adult stem cells. So we don't have to, basically all the pluses and none of the minuses.
Exactly.
So it's pretty cool. And so they're very close to being able to use these IPS cells to be able to turn them into whatever kind of cell they want. So it's very cool. And so these adults, one of the problems though with the embryonic stem cells and why they haven't had much success with them is that they're kind of unstable. They tend to cause tumors or turn into tumors, and then they also, a lot of times they'll try to use them and put them in a patient, and then what will happen is their body will reject those cells because it detects, oh, this isn't from me. But with adult stem cells, it's nice because it's already part of their body recognizes it, it doesn't try to reject it.
Yeah, so this could be the most promising breakthrough we've seen in stem cells in a long time. And you know, what's actually happening here, with embryonic stem cells, not only are they immoral, they don't work. We have zero cures, zero treatments from them, despite millions of dollars being poured into this research. With adult stem cells, there are over 100 different conditions that can be cured or therapy, including skin cancer, breast cancer, leukemia, lymphoma, MS, chronic liver failure, osteoporosis, sickle cell anemia, Parkinson's, acute hearing damage, just to name a few. So this is wildly successful, and yet people keep funding the embryonic kind, and they say, no, we're not interested. And this is really showing this development that we want to go for the adult stem cells. And one thing that I thought was really interesting here, it mentioned that one of the big contributions to this latest breakthrough in technology are these Catholic doctors who refused to cooperate with the embryonic stem cell research. And so they said, we're going to keep looking, keep looking, keep looking, and they found this. And I think that is so neat that, you know, when we Catholics are actually living out our faith the way that we're called to, we can actually make the world a better place. We can actually have these improvements in science. It's not in conflict with our faith, it cooperates.
Absolutely, and I think that's what it's all about, because I think people sometimes get the misconception that the Catholic Church is against science and they don't want progress, they're against women, they're against homosexuals, and it's not about that at all. We're all about the human race, but we, you know, feel that we have a belief that came from God, and is you know, that information is brought to us through the church regarding human life and regarding the way that God wants us to live so that we can have happiness, eternal happiness especially, is what our end goal is. And so, you know, I think that's spot on, right? Like you said, with how we can live this out in our lives every day and how we should oppose these things. And I love it when like things like this come together, where it ends up being like the way that we were doing things is actually ends up being the easier way or the most successful way, right? It's just kind of nice to have that extra encouragement, I guess.
Absolutely.
And this is a case with embryonic stem cell research. It's just a case of the ends don't justify the means, right? You can't, yes, there's a great outcome, right? There could be, if anything.
Right, there hasn't been.
Right, there hasn't been yet.
There could
Potentially there could be, right? And so it doesn't, the ends don't justify the means, right? It's, by embryologists are unanimous in their statement in saying that, listen, human life begins at conception, right? And so when a sperm meets an egg, as we've talked about earlier, that is a human life. So even though we can't see these people like necessarily, you know, under a microscope, we can. Doesn't matter if it's a zygote or an embryo or a toddler or a teenager or an elderly person, right? It's a person, right? No matter the stage their stage in development. And I think we have to remember that. And that's why it's so important for us to oppose embryonic stem cell research.
That's huge. And now, you know, to see these statements that, you know, researchers are saying realistically many scientists aren't even using embryonic stem cells anymore because there's such greater promise with these adult stem cells that can be induced into an embryonic state.
Exactly.
That's so encouraging, and I think that's where you look at the funding. That's where the funding is going. The Maryland Stem Cell Research Commission, back in 2007, they were funding 11 embryonic stem cell projects and 4 non-embryonic. And now, or in 2013, they were only funding 1 embryonic stem cell. They went from 11 to 1. And now they're funding 28 non-embryonic. So it went from 4 to 28. So that's where the private money is shifting because people aren't seeing any return on their investment. So simply, you know, they're cooperating with morality and simply because they're seeing the outcome there. And so I think this just shows us that God's design for our lives, his plan for our lives is good. And there are times when we're asked to suffer and there are times when it's going to be difficult. But he doesn't come up with all these rules, and the church doesn't come up with all these rules because, oh, so mean and so restrictive and so oppressive. It's because the church understands human nature and is calling us to respect humanity and realizes that this is going to be good for us.
Absolutely. And you know, this has been a contested thing, right? George W. Bush, he restricted funding for a time, and then in, I think it was 2009, President Obama overturned that ruling that said, you know, we're going to allow funds for stem cell research,
for
embryonic stem cell research. And so it's been contested, but I like to hear this from scientists, that they're saying, okay, we think that this debate is going to be settled because of these new stem cells.
Absolutely, very encouraging.
All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can read more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode.
That's it for this week. Until next time, please keep us in your prayers.
God bless.